Hello, I'm Paige Wilkins, and I'm a third year here at UC, majoring in both psychology and women, gender, and sexuality studies. And this is my presentation on sexual orientation in ancient Greece. To begin, I'm going to give an overview of what we already know. So, in ancient Greece, sexual orientation was viewed quite differently from modern concepts of sexual identity. The Greeks did not categorize individuals based on sexual orientation in the way that we do today. Instead, relationships and sexual behaviors were often defined by roles, power dynamics, and social statuses rather than the gender of the individuals involved. One of the most famous forms of sexual relationships in ancient Greece was pederasty. This was recognized as a relationship between an adult man, the Erostes, and a younger male, usually in his teens, the eromenos. This relationship often had a mentoring component and was sometimes sexual, but it was more about the dynamics of mentorship and social initiation. Same-sex relationships between adult men, specifically among the upper classes, were also quite common in ancient Greece, especially in cities like Athens. These relationships were often seen as a matter of social bonding and camaraderie rather than as defining sexual identity. They might coexist with heterosexual marriages, as Greek men married women for the sake of procreation and managing family life. And finally, same-sex relationships were often understood in terms of power dynamics, with clear distinctions between the active and passive roles in sexual encounters. These roles were not necessarily tied to one's sexual orientation, but rather to societal views on masculinity, honor, and social status. The active partner was typically the older male, and this person was expected to take the Erostes role, which was seen as a dominant, socially respectable position, whereas the passive partner, often a younger male, also known as the eromenos, was expected to take the receptive role, which was seen as less socially prestigious. So the Greeks were not necessarily gay because they did not divide the world of sexual identities into homo and heterosexual. It actually seemed to matter very little whether a man was interested in having sex with an attractive younger male or woman. Most of the criticism of these homosexual relationships came from power dynamics. So the passive homosexual was not rejected for his homosexuality, but for his passivity. Virtually all examples of what you could call homophobia that are adduced prove to target more narrowly specific instances of gender deviance. So men were often criticized as sexually passive, whereas women are attacked when they do what men do in bed. So for my next point, there are some critiques on Dover's active-passive model. So domination and submission have to do with the social structuration of sexuality. They do not tell us what it felt like to be in love, and they do not capture the emotional tone of the pederastic relationships described by Plato and often mocked by Aristophanes. Greek men might really, truly, and deeply have loved their beloved boys, but it does not make their system of sexual signification ours. This brings me into my final bullet point. Should we think of Greek men as active and passive rather than straight and gay? To answer this, sexuality could not have existed in any society anywhere much before the 19th century because sexuality is the modern deployment of a particular set of discourse that came into being relatively late in the history of the West. So we shouldn't think of Greek men as straight or gay. We should think of them more in their active and passive roles. So in this next slide, I'm going to talk about pederasty in aristocratic and popular audiences. Dover argues that there isn't just one Greek opinion on same-sex relationships with young boys. Instead, the opinions differ depending on the audience, the general public versus the elite. For ordinary Athenians, pederasty was often seen as morally wrong. They believed it was a corrupt practice mainly associated with the elite. This view likely stemmed from the fact that proper pederasty required a lot of money and leisure time, making it a practice that only the rich could afford. Aristocratic men like Plato and Xenophon saw pederasty in a different light. They often associate it with education and social refinement. In their writings, the practice took place in spaces that required wealth and leisure, like symposia, aka drinking parties, and other elite social settings. Wealth was important not just for access to these spaces, but also for the gifts and poetry that accompanied courtship. The practice of courtship was expensive. Gifts like fighting cocks or quail were costly, and the men had to spend time and money writing poetry or speeches to impress their young lovers. However, despite the expense, both popular and elite sources criticized the excessive spending on young boys. A speech by Isaiah that was written for a popular audience criticizes the wasteful spending on young boys, contrasting it with his own respectable use of money, such as providing marriage settlements for his sisters. Xenophon, writing for an elite audience, was more sympathetic towards spending on young boys, but still expressed concerns about the cost. He mentions it alongside other expensive pursuits, like raising horses. Even if a man could not afford the costly rituals of pederastic courtship, he could still admire the practice and aspire to it. There was a general assumption in Athenian society that all adult men found beautiful young boys sexually attractive, and participation in pederasty was seen as a way to elevate one's social status. Next, I'm going to discuss the prosecution of Timarchus in 346 BC. This is the only surviving work of Greek literature on a substantial scale which is entirely concerned with homosexual relationships and practices. This case is known from a speech by the orator Demosthenes. Timarchus was an Athenian citizen, and the speech focuses not just on his sexual conduct, but on how that conduct supposedly undermined his political and moral fitness to hold public office. Timarchus was accused of dishonoring the city of Athens, but the central focus of his prosecution was his alleged behavior in homosexual relationships, which were thought to affect his moral integrity and, by extension, his political character. The speech is notable because it represents the Athenian legal and moral framework for understanding male homosexuality, particularly pederasty. The speech was delivered by Demosthenes during a time of political instability in Athens, as the city faced growing threats from Philip II of Macedon and struggled with eternal factionalism. The prosecution against Timarchus came at a time when Athenians were particularly concerned about maintaining their civic and moral integrity. Timarchus had been an active and controversial figure in Athenian politics, and Demosthenes used the trial to attack him, presenting his sexual behavior as evidence of his unsuitability for public life. The core of the prosecution was Timarchus's alleged sexual relationships with older men when he was a young man. In Athens, sexual relationships between adult men and younger men were common and often formed part of the educational and social fabric. However, for a man to be eligible for public office, it was important that his sexual behavior conformed to certain norms. Timarchus's behavior was being portrayed as a violation of these norms, particularly because he was accused of having been the passive partner in these relationships. Demosthenes argued that someone who had violated social and sexual norms could not be trusted to represent the interest of the Athenian people. The speech implied that Timarchus's sexual behavior was a reflection of his character and would inevitably make him vulnerable to bribery, corruption, and unfit for holding office. The core of the argument was that a man who had compromised his honor and personal matters was likely to do so in political life as well. Another key part of the prosecution was that Timarchus had squandered his wealth on frivolous pleasures, including his relationships with young boys. This was tied to a broader moral critique of his character, suggesting that his indulgence in luxury and sexual excess mirrored a general disregard for Athens' values. In the speech, Demosthenes contrasts Timarchus's behavior with that of other public figures who were seen as more virtuous. The trial of Timarchus was not only a personal moral indictment, but also had serious political consequences. As an accused figure, Timarchus faced the possibility of being disenfranchised, a punishment that could include the loss of his citizenship, which would prevent him from participating in public office, the assembly, or the courts. In the case of Timarchus, the accusation of immoral sexual behavior was used as a legal means to challenge his eligibility to hold political office. The prosecution of Timarchus was successful in its aims, and he was disenfranchised. The loss of his citizenship meant he was stripped of his political rights and barred from holding office. The exact nature of his sexual activities and whether they were as scandalous as described by Demosthenes remains unclear, but the case remains a powerful example of how sexual morality was intertwined with political life in Athens. The prosecution of Timarchus in 346 BCE is a key moment in Athenian legal and moral history, offering us a glimpse into how homosexual relationships were viewed in the context of political life. The case centers on the social and moral consequences of being perceived as sexually deviant according to Athenian norms, where private behavior was seen as indicative of public character. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the vase world, but I did want to touch on some mistakes that earlier scholars have made when interpreting decorations on vases. The decorations on pots are too often taken as representative, as if offering an accurate cross-sample of what people actually did. However, we can never really know what the Greeks actually did in the privacy of their own rooms. This quote by Lier resonates with the statement that I just made. Vase painting is often more explicit about sex than textual resources, and it is tempting to treat it as direct evidence for sexual practices. For example, many scholars have considered intercrural scenes as proof that the Greeks actually practiced intercrural intercourse. Vase painting is, however, not documentary photography, but an artistic genre. In general, it presents a highly idealized vision of elite males and their activities. That's all I'm going to say on the vase world, but I did want to include this in my presentation so that the next time you are looking at a vase painting, you do not assume that this was the true reality in ancient Greece. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope that you learned something new about sexual orientation in ancient Greece.